you had a NATO chief warns that there will be no quick ending to the war in Ukraine. And my first reaction to that is, how convenient for the weapon manufacturers, right? Once again, Raytheon and Boeing is undefeated in war. They won another one. So before I dive into this topic, because you had the G7, you had all these Western leaders that essentially pledged for endless, never-ending war in Ukraine, like the NATO chief here says. But I want to get your guys' thoughts on this. Eddie, we can start with you. Regarding your thoughts on the Ukraine war, the West's approach regarding refusing to negotiate for peace in this war and the geopolitical ramifications, especially on the food supply and the global working class. What does it take from Midwestern Marx in general regarding the Ukraine war and how we should approach it?
Yeah, a lot of people don't know what I think is the most important fact that's come out since the Russian involvement in the war in the Donbass that's been raging since 2014. And that's that there was a peace agreement on the table, that Zelenskyy and Putin were in talks to go forward with a peace agreement that would bring an end to the fighting. And the U.S. and NATO sent Boris Johnson to put heavy pressure on Zelenskyy to break that up and make sure that didn't happen. So, I mean, that gives away the game. That shows exactly what the U.S. wants here, as have, lots of different pieces of evidence that have come out, like Angela Merkel saying that NATO was never going to follow the Minsk Accords and that their plan was to just build up NATO military capacity in Ukraine endlessly. But it's you still have people denying that the U.S. is waging a proxy war when, the writing's on the wall. It couldn't be more obvious to anybody who's paying attention. I mean, it's clear in 2020 or 2021, NATO held a summit and said our main targets going forward are Russia and China, and then began funneling all their efforts and all their resources towards the proxy war in Ukraine, which is just a proxy war against Russia. And something I've been drawing attention to forever is that they do want to make this a forever war. There was an article that was published a while back by the Atlantic Council, which is basically just a think tank that serves as a mouthpiece for the military-industrial complex. And they were saying Zelenskyy wants to make Ukraine into a big Israel, a bigger version of Israel. Here is a roadmap. Here's a roadmap on how to do it. Like, he wants to do that. He wants to turn his country into an apartheid state that is a constant center of warfare and fighting, where the U.S. and NATO are constantly dumping weapons in, and they're just eternally at war. That's what Zelenskyy wants to turn Ukraine into, and the U.S. military-industrial complex is completely on board with it. So, I think every leftist in the U.S., anyone who considers themselves a leftist, should be staunchly against the proxy war and should focus most of their anger at NATO.
Yeah, this is my line in the sand. Line in the sand. Like, a lot of betrayals we've seen from the PMC class. They think they can get away with this one, fam. They're like, oh, come on, man, we should disagree on Ukraine. Nah, fam. You're not going to team up with NATO. I'm not going to allow you guys to be Nazi collaborators like you guys are. There's a black market boom of guns that neo-Nazis and other terrorist groups, to be clear as well, are receiving because of the Ukraine war and lack of oversight, and the fact that we're giving billions of dollars of weapons to the most corrupt country in Europe as well. Carlos, I want to get you in here. Anything you want to add, your perspective on the Ukraine war and their goal to push it and make it a never-ending war?
Well, I don't think that's possible. It's clear to everyone with two fingers in front of them, who can see two fingers in front of them, that this proxy war is an utter failure. In the 15-week so-called counteroffensive, more than 71,000 Ukrainians have died. They've literally started a process of repartitions. Like, they're trying to bring back Ukrainians who have fled the country so that they can fight, because they're running low on just manpower. In the meantime, Russia has been able to sign up more than 300,000 people, and they're preparing for a serious offensive now as soon as the counteroffensive is done. So I think at best what the U.S. and NATO would want, and some specialists suggest this, is some form of frozen conflict that would allow them to keep that alive in some form, but have their central focus be on China. And Russia doesn't want that. Russia it's very clear about what it wants, and it wants to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. It sees this, and the communists in Russia and the communists in Ukraine they had to flee to Russia because they were abandoned and persecuted in Ukraine. They've seen this as an existential war against fascism, which is what the left here, even the most progressive parts of the left, do not understand. Our
Yeah.
comrades over there see this as a war against fascism, and it is a war against fascism. And
It is.
you listen to some of the recent things that Blinken is saying. These people are insane. They're willing to tiptoe us into the U.S. becoming a belligerent in this conflict explicitly. It already was. We know it's a U.S. proxy war against Russia, but explicitly a belligerent. They've okayed the sending of long-range missiles into Russian territory by Ukraine, and they are much more open to these attacks that are taking place in Russian territories, and that pretty soon it seems like will begin to be done with American weapons, which means that the U.S. and NATO will be officially involved in a conflict, and Russia's not going to let that happen. They've been rational enough and held back in their actions enough, but they don't want this war to last on forever. It's pretty rational, the demands that they're asking for. And, even Zelenskyy has noted that some of the will to continue this proxy war has kind of fell off. And he stated in a recent conversation that it's not going to end in a good story if the West doesn't continue or escalate their support of Ukraine, basically implying that these Nazi elements are going to basically participate in terrorist attacks all over Europe, which are threats that had been made previously by some of the more fascistic and Nazi leaders in Ukraine, but now it was kind of the quiet hidden part was said out loud by Zelenskyy as a sort of threat in the case of the West pulling back and deciding to not pursue this conflict any longer. So it's an existential fight, not just for the Russians, but for people all over the place, because it's a threat against humanity that our ruling class is waging over there, and for no good reason. Like the empire is already crumbling, the world is turning away from the U.S. and from U.S.-dominated global financial institutions, and the rise of BRICS represents the fact that a new world is already here. It might be in its infant stages, but it's already here. So what we're seeing is a demented ruling class that's nicely symbolized by the fact that we have political leaders like Mitch McConnell, which are just freezing themselves, and people like Joe Biden, but they are in many ways a representation of the state that the American empire is in. So they're just needlessly escalating us into a very serious, potentially nuclear Armageddon situation for the sustenance of a hegemony that's already gone. The U.S. is no longer hegemonic. It's hegemonic in one part of the world, but it's already a new world that has been born. And they couldn't even get the G20 summit to produce a statement against the Russian special military operation. So if you look at the BRICS summit in Johannesburg, the Russia-Africa summit, what resulted from the G20 summit, now the G77 plus China summit, and now in a month, in October, China's going to have the BRICS summit that Putin was just invited to and accepted the invitation. It's a new world that's here, and either we fight back against our elite, which are the ones that are waging this global class war against the peoples of the world, or they're going to take humanity down with them.
I want to piggyback on what you were saying earlier regarding Russia viewing this as an existential crisis to their country. You had the Nazis that killed tens of millions of people that came through Ukraine. You had Napoleon a generation or so before that killed many Russians during his invasion that came through Ukraine as well. You have banderites who very open about purging Russian citizens, ban the Russian language, commit political violence on their border. Of course, they would view that as a threat to their existence, and that's why Putin has around an 80 to 85% approval despite waging this special military operation, because every Russian person knows someone who was killed by Nazis. So the threat is real. It's not hypothetical to them. So they support their leader, Putin. And that's why the propaganda in this country is all about Putin has gone in, Putin holding Russia hostage. They make it about the guy. Putin is Dr. Evil, right? Putin is Lex Luthor. He's this evil villain that somehow captured and brainwashed the stupid Russians to follow him. No, the Russian people are smart, right? Just like the Chinese are smart, right? Just like the Taiwan people who want the status quo, who don't want to be the new Ukraine. They smart. We can get to that soon. They understand what's going on here. That's why they support Putin and getting rid of an existential threat. And Russia's been successful in a lot of ways because there was a lot of high-ranking Banderite Azov battalion people who's been killed and neutralized over the last course of this year. Now, there's still this fascist Nazi element in Ukraine, but they've been significantly weakened because many of their leaders have been killed in this crisis, and that's exactly what Putin and the Russians want to happen. Now, to show you guys what we're talking about, and I don't use the term fascist easily. I just don't use it on everybody. You had Zelenskyy who banned opposition parties, banned left parties, while leaving fascist right-wing parties intact. So not like he's like, all right, everyone calm down. We need a one state, one party rule. No, he kept the fascists. He kept all the far-right parties, got rid of the socialists. And you had Ukraine that banned collective bargaining. Oh, shit, I closed on accident. Let's see if I can. Let's see. I'll pull it back up. Here it is. I fucked up. I almost closed on accident. Here we go. Ukraine law stripping workers of collective bargaining rights slammed by TUCs. So they banned the ability for people to collectively bargain. But the Bernie Sanders NATO left is full-fledged support of this fascist anti-worker state. You guys see why this blow my mind? And I can't let it go. It's kind of weird to me. Now, last thing I saw show, I kind of went long on this segment, but a lot to say here. Julian Assange, someone that the United States killing in a fascistic way, going after their enemies, people who expose their war crimes as a textbook tenet of fascism, cracking down on dissent, waging war against the free press. You had Biden and the Democrats pretend they're friends of free speech and the freedom of the press as they're killing this guy because this guy's been right about everything, essentially. So here Julian Assange explaining how the United States do not wage war to win. The war in Ukraine is not about winning. You had many people just admit it. They're like, yeah, we know Ukraine is fucked. Russia going to accomplish all their geopolitical objectives in Ukraine, wiping off the Azov regime. Ukraine as a state, as we know, is not going to exist. But the goal is not to win. The goal is just to weaken Russian forces and to have Raytheon and Boeing win and make record profits like they've been doing. Now let's listen to Julian here.
Because the goal is not to completely subjugate Afghanistan. The goal is to use Afghanistan to wash money out of the tax bases of the United States, out of the tax bases of European countries, through Afghanistan and back into the hands of a transnational security elite. That is the goal, i.e. the goal is to have an endless war, not a successful war.
Once again, it doesn't matter how many Ukrainians die. It doesn't matter if they stop Russia from accomplishing their geopolitical objectives. It's about having an endless war where weapon manufacturers win. Raytheon and Boeing win, no matter what. If the Zelenskyy regime ends, Raytheon and Boeing wins, no matter what. And that is what it's about. Any last thoughts on this segment? I want to move on to another one while we have time. I'm going to keep this around an hour, so I'll pass it to you guys before we move on.
Yeah, the only thing I wonder at this point is whether or not Zelenskyy will be allowed to stay in power, because he can, the NATO and the U.S. continue to push a peace agreement off of the table, and as they do that, Russia's getting closer and closer. Their special military operation is coming closer and closer to its completion, and I know they didn't want regime change in Ukraine. That's not part of the stated objectives, but Zelenskyy is certainly a rogue actor at this point. What he's trying to do is get NATO as involved in this conflict as he possibly can, because that's his only way out. He's acted as a pawn.
He wanted Article 5. He called for, sorry to interrupt, Eddie, but he called for NATO Article 5 multiple times, which would have started World War III, fam. Like these are things that Zelenskyy criticized his allies in the West. He's like, oh my God, you guys won't use Article 5. Like, what? Anyway, sorry, Eddie, I want you to continue, but that's a great point.
No, for sure. Exactly. No, that makes the point better. That's exactly what he's trying to do. And I mean, think about it from his position. He's acted as a puppet of the U.S. until this point. Now Russia's getting closer to his doorstep, and he either needs to find a peace agreement and find a way out, or Russia's going to take him out, likely, is how I see it going. But there's no hope for Ukraine at this point. Unfortunately, I've met in the wrestling community a lot of Ukrainians who have been fleeing the country because right now the SBU, the Ukrainian intelligence, is just going around and picking people up, like kidnapping them in vans and then taking them to the front lines to fight because they're out of soldiers, they're running out of weapons. It's a disastrous situation, which is why it's ironic that the people who support the proxy war claim to be pro-Ukraine, when really this is the destruction of the country and people of Ukraine that we're seeing. But
yeah, like I said, it's sad. Like when people say, are you saying that all Ukraine are Nazis? I'm not saying that. There are many Ukrainians who are against the Banderites and they wanted peace, but they was pressured by political violence by the Banderites in Ukraine. There were peace rallies that was attacked by Banderites, the people who did not want peace. And you have, like you said, wrestlers, a lot of great wrestlers that come out of Ukraine. A lot of great boxers as well. Vasily Lomachenko, one of my favorite boxers to watch. Lomachenko is a Ukrainian. They got a lot of talented people there. It's a shame that NATO is sacrificing their culture and their people simply because they want a never-ending expansion. That's why we are angry at them, not because out of malicious or malicious feelings toward Ukrainian people. I have malicious feelings toward the Banderites, don't get me wrong, but the average Ukrainian people who are victims of NATO expansion and Zelenskyy selling their people out, we have to maintain anger because they have been victims in this conflict. Carlos, I'll pass you for last thoughts, and then we're going to talk about some Chinese propaganda, war propaganda I've seen on both sides, which is crazy. But Carlos, last thoughts on the segment, and we move on.
Yeah, I want to bring it back to the comment on Assange, because I think that there's something that's a little bit different with the war against Russia and China than the war against Afghanistan. I don't think Afghanistan ever threatened like a new world order. So it was very clear that the objective was endless war, and there was no purpose besides just let's make a fuckload of money for Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and all that. In this war against Russia and against China, I see it a little bit more like the original Cold War against the Soviet Union, where there was a mixture of, yes, we need that boogeyman that we can install, that we can make the object of fear in our people in order to legitimize these wars that get the donor class, the billionaires, and the military-industrial complex extremely rich. But we also don't want them to win. So like it's a mixture of we want to drag this on, but we also want them to lose, and we want them beat back. And I think that's part of what the U.S. wants out of these wars. It wants to squeeze out as much money as possible for the donor class, but it also doesn't want to just lose. It doesn't want what's going on now, which is like these are great powers, non-imperialist great powers, as Hugo Chavez and Maduro have commented on, that are bringing about a new world order. So I think it's a little bit different from the issue in Afghanistan. I don't think they cared about Afghanistan, but not to the extent that they care today about this like squashing defeat that they've faced.
You had many generals and many people in corporate media that just straight up say that one of the goals of this war, even at the cost of massive Ukrainian casualties, is to degrade the Russian military, and they view that this war as a way to do that. But one thing that happened on this war is that they awakened the beast of the Russian military-industrial complex, where they are firing on all cylinders with weapon production. I saw a speech maybe a week ago where Putin was talking about this. I don't have it on me on hand right now. Where he was talking about how he was praising his weapon production and the West is awakened the beast, and now they understand that the West want to wage war. So the Russian people gotta harden their heart and get ready for that. So they want to degrade the Russian military, but all they do is, what I think they're doing is reawakening Russia's will to fight against an existential threat,